order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee for our hearing today under our ongoing inquiry about the impact of COVID on workers and businesses. Today we have two panels. Firstly, we'll be talking to the GMB and Centrica about an ongoing dispute about the use of fire and rehire tactics, and then a second panel looking at the long-term impact of COVID on the labour market and thinking about what we need to do in the future to support workers recover from the consequences of COVID on the economy. Before we get going, I'd like to invite colleagues to declare their relevant interests. I have an interest as the chair of the Institute of Artificial Intelligence, which is a global network of legislators interested in the regulation of AI, related to a question on automation and productivity in the session later today. Other colleagues, would you please declare any interest that you might have? Judith Cummings, please. Yeah.
Yes, Chair. I've got an interest. I've been a member of the GMB for over 20 years.
Thanks, Judith. And Charlotte?
I need to declare an interest as a member of the GMB since I was about 16 or so, and a former staff member of GMB before coming into Parliament. Thanks,
Charlotte. And any others from colleagues? Okay, thanks very much. Well, look, so the first panel today, we're delighted to welcome Justin Bowden, who's the National Officer of the GMB Union, and Chris O'Shea, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Centrica. Good morning to both of you. We obviously have called you today because of the ongoing dispute taking place at Centrica and the trade union's concerns about the use of fire and rehire tactics as part of the round of redundancy negotiations taking place at British Gas, which is of course owned by Centrica. I should say that we won't be able to call all colleagues on the committee to ask questions today because of time, but there is cross-party full committee concern about where we've ended up in this process, which is why we wrote to you in correspondence a few months ago about the use of fire and rehire. And it's unfortunate, I think, that we've ended up today having to call you both for oral evidence session before the committee. But we are where we are, and we're keen to understand as a committee why we are where we are, not least because we've got the Employment Rights Bill coming up soon, and there's, I think, quite a lot of support across the House of Commons, including seemingly from the Secretary of State, that fire and rehire should only be used in the most extreme of circumstances, and increasingly politicians on a cross-party basis are calling for it to be made illegal. So having looked at the submissions from both of your organisations, I can see there's a lot of detail. We won't have time to go through all of that detail today, but it seems to me there are two substantive issues or issues of dispute that I'd like to understand further today. The first is about the relationship between Centrica and GMB as a recognised trade union. And the second, which we'll get into with colleagues' questions, is about some of the outstanding items in the negotiations, which seems to be primarily about the increase on engineers' working time from 37 to 40 hours a week, without, in their view, a commensurate increase in pay for the extra hours they're being asked to work. I'm just going to kick off with a question on the relationship between the business and the trade union before calling colleagues. And Mr. O'Shea, from a Centrica perspective, I can see from the submissions, both from you and the GMB, that the announcement of 5,000 redundancies was made on the 11th of June last year, and that the Section 188 notice, so the fire and rehire notice, was issued on the 15th of July, so very soon after the announcement, and that also all of the existing collective bargaining agreements with the union were terminated at the same time. It seems very unusual to do all of that at the beginning of a negotiation around redundancies. Do you have any regrets about how you've managed the relationship with your trade union?
So firstly, Chair, I'm delighted to be here to be able to contribute to this conversation. It's a matter of regret that we are talking about an ongoing industrial dispute, but it is something that's very important. So as you see, we announced on the 11th of June that we wanted to streamline our company, modernise our company, and we wanted to enter into discussions about terms and conditions. And the reason is I've been at Centrica for just over 2 years, and we've lost thousands of jobs in those 2 years. And this has actually been going on for a number of years. And I want to put a stop to that. Now, that might sound odd when the announcement was made with up to 5,000 redundancies. 1,000 of those redundancies would have been in the US. We've sold that business. So in the UK, it would be 4,000. And the vast majority of those redundancies are in the management layers. And the idea is our company is too complicated. And we've lost sight of what's important, which is the customer. And so the job losses that we announced increase the proportion of customer-facing staff from 73% to 85%. So it's all about empowering the company, the frontline employees, and taking 3 layers of management out. We also wanted to modernise our terms and conditions. We have some that go back to when we were a state-owned company, 1986, over 7,000 variations. And the reason that I wanted to do that was we have 20,000 well-paid jobs in the UK. And I would rather do everything I can to protect and ultimately grow those jobs than to continue going through round after round of redundancy. So we announced that we wanted to modernise our terms and conditions. Now, we, as you say, issued a Section 188 notice on the 15th of July. My regret is that our interpretation of the law is that when there's a possibility that there might be terminations, dismissals, you have to notify your recognised trade unions and employee reps up front in order for there to be a meaningful consultation. Now, I don't think that the way the law is drafted just now helps with negotiations. I understand why Mr. Bowden and the GMB feel that that contaminates negotiations. I would feel similar to that. But I think what we can't have is companies not being able to make changes to terms and conditions at all. But we can, and I hope we do, change where in the process that has to be notified. Because I don't think the law as it's currently drafted helps us in these conversations. So that's my big regret, that our interpretation of the law requires us to serve that notice as soon as we think there's a chance that we won't have a negotiated settlement. Now, hopefully I've demonstrated by being in negotiations for several months thereafter that I'm committed to a negotiated settlement. I have been from the start, and I remain committed to that.
Thank you for that. I would just push you a little on the defence you've made that it's about the interpretation of the law and not the decisions you made as CEO about how to treat the trade union. I mean, the redundancy announcement on the 11th of June was for 5,000 jobs. You issued a Section 188 to all 20,000 employees, as I understand it. And let me just give you one example. I understand from a submission from the GMB that your Chief Operating Officer, David House, said that you did that because it operated as an insurance policy. I'm not clear what the difference is between an insurance policy and a threat to fire everybody. Can you help us understand that?
So I think the first thing is that the Section 188 notices were issued to our employee representatives rather than to 20,000 employees. Our interpretation of the law is that as soon as we think there's a possibility that we won't have a negotiated settlement, we have to issue that notice.
What made you think there wouldn't be a negotiated settlement at the start of the negotiation?
Because the first meeting that we had with our recognised trade unions was on the 8th and 9th of July. And we laid out the case for change and laid out the areas we wanted to talk about. And we then had a joint statement from GMB and Unison on the 10th of July, which said that they would fight these changes and wouldn't accept them. And whilst you could argue that you would expect a trade union to do that, our interpretation of the law and my advice, my legal advice, was that that meant it was possible that we wouldn't have a negotiated settlement. And that was the point at which our advice, my advice, was that we should issue the Section 188 notice. What I hoped when we did that, and I did challenge that advice, what I hoped when we did that was we'd be able to set that aside and go into negotiations, which we did. And I hoped also that given that our unions, to their credit, also came to those negotiations, was that all sides were able to put that Section 188 notice to one side and negotiate in good faith. And the fact that we didn't see any industrial action at that point, at the point we issued the Section 188 notice, gave me some real hope that we could have a negotiated settlement, which was and remains my number one priority.
Thank you. And Mr. Bowden, do you recognise Mr. O'Shea's answer there, that in that initial meeting you made it clear that you weren't willing to negotiate and that will legitimise the Section 188 notice?
Thanks very much, Chair. Look, I think it's just useful to put this into a little bit of context very quickly if I can. We, as in GMB, have had a very long association with Centrica British Gas in its various incarnations that actually dates back about 130 years to when our union was founded. And we have a history of being able to work through change. That's what we do as trade unions, and we have very, very successfully done that for decades and decades with British Gas. In my working experience as a full-time official over 25 years, I've never had a circumstance where before we have even begun formal negotiations that the employer has put what our members quite correctly describe as a gun to their head and said that we will sack and rehire, if necessary, the entire workforce if you do not agree to the changes that we want to make. And you correctly summed up, Chair, with it being an insurance policy. The bulletin to which Mr. O'Shea refers was exactly the sort of bulletin that a company like British Gas would be very familiar with from its trade unions. What do they expect us as unions to say when we're told that there's going to be 5,000 job losses and changes to 26 terms and conditions, other than to say we'll stick up for our members? That's what we do unapologetically. The problem was that by issuing the fire and rehire in the way that that the company chose to do, it effectively poisoned the well. So it created a situation of conflict immediately from the start, whereas the history of our relationship with this company is to find a way forward by negotiation. And we have always been able to do that with an odd skirmish here and there. We have negotiated 2 successive changes to pensions to the benefit of the company and to the disbenefit of our members in only the last couple of years. So it was very regrettable that this is what set the tone and effectively leads us in many ways to the position that we are now, which is a workforce that feels done to rather than worked with, and that doesn't make for good business.
Thank you, Mr. Braddock. I tend to agree that Section 188 is often used as a power play as opposed to trying to seek a negotiation, which is unfortunate. Charlotte Nichols, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. O'Shea. To what extent do you acknowledge an additional responsibility to avoid job losses and deteriorating pay during a time of severe economic downturn and a rise in unemployment? I visited the Stockport picket line over the weekend and have had a number of emails and social media messages from British Gas engineers who are incredibly distressed about the prospect of finding work outside British Gas if they don't accept these new contracts. So as the chief executive, what responsibility do you take for that?
So ultimately, I have responsibility for everything that our company does. The dispute at the moment is primarily with engineers. When we entered into the negotiations, and we have moved substantially in those negotiations, the base case for me was that we would not cut people's pay, because I believe that our colleagues have got lifestyles and commitments based on what they earn. But the inescapable fact is that we are between 30 and 50% more expensive than a contractor. Our direct labour model is more expensive. And what that means is that if we continue on the path that we're on, we will continue to lose direct labour colleagues and replace them with contractors because we're not competitive. This is about being competitive. Now, I would say that the offer that we've made, which increases, as the chairman said, working hours for 2/3 of our engineers from 37 to 40 hours. 1/3 of them already work 40 hours or more. Those that work more, there are very few numbers, but they will actually reduce to 40 hours. The offer that we've made, which for a gas service repair engineer is a base salary of just under £40,000. For installations engineers, about £36,500. Smart engineers, £29,000. I think these are good offers. Some of our colleagues, about 20% of our colleagues, will have pay rises under this. A substantial number of our colleagues will see more holidays. So I know that we're asking a lot of our colleagues to go from 37 to 40 hours per week. But the reality is that we've lost too many jobs over the past several years. And when we can see that our direct labour model is far more expensive than a contractor model, something has to give. Now, I didn't want to cut people's pay, and I thought it was reasonable to ask them to work 40 hours a week. I regret that we're in this dispute, and I'm responsible for every decision this company makes. But I don't want to stand by and watch more jobs being lost. Now, one thing I would add, if I may, is that we have under-recruited over the past several years in terms of apprentices because our terms and conditions are not competitive. And I think in the past 18 months, we've recruited 48 apprentices. Today we're recruiting, and we will create 1,000 new apprentice roles by the end of next year. And we already have 5,000 applications. I'm excited about that. These jobs will help to deliver net zero. And I know this committee is looking at that as well. These are the jobs of the future. So I regret the fact that we have people worried for their future. But I'm excited about growing jobs, and I'll do everything I can to maintain and grow the well-paid jobs that we've got today.
I think Mr. Bowden had his hand up there. Did you want to add something?
Just very quickly, if I could, please, Charlotte, if that's okay. I mean, just two things really. This is an area of the economy where people understand hourly rates, and in simple terms, the current hourly rate is between 14 and 19 pounds per hour, depending on what sort of engineer that you're talking about. And under this, the proposals that were in dispute over, for the majority of engineers, around about 5,000 being asked to move from 37 to 40 hours, there is, of course, those additional 3 hours per week, which on top of that, they're being asked to do an extra half hour at the end and the beginning of the day. So that makes between 5.5 and 8 hours a day of work for free. There is the possibility of earning the 3 hours back, but there are no guarantees over that. That pushes the effective hourly rate to around about 15.50 per hour, which is pretty much on a par with the wider economy over this. And I think for people who are familiar, members of the public, with what it costs to get a gas engineer out or an electrician, then that rate of pay for providing coverage Monday to Sunday across weekends and into the evening is not a king's ransom by any means. And then just in terms of profitability, I'm taking this straight from the company accounts, but in the first 6 months of 2020, the adjusted operating profit of the Centrica home business, this is where the engineers in dispute work, was £229 million, an increase of 27% on the same period. And the just recently departed CFO, so Chief Finance Officer for Centrica, Jonathan Ford, said in July 2020, you can see that in the numbers, the UK business is up 27%. I think that speaks to a very stable business with high levels of retention and recurring revenue. Customers are flat to slightly down, but profits have increased a little bit. I think this is a service business that can grow its profitability. And I just say on profitability, we have no problem with the business being profitable. We want that to be the case. That's good for our members. But the deal has to be fair, and it has to be beneficial to them and reasonable, both in terms of how they are paid, but also on their work-life balance and the time they spend with their families.
Thank you for that. Moving on to my next question, which is also to Mr. O'Shea. Has Centrica received from the government support during the pandemic? And if so, were they aware of your plans to fire and rehire workers when you received this support?
So the first thing I'd say is the speed with which the government put in place the coronavirus job retention scheme was impressive and appreciated by Centrica and I think many other companies. When we faced into the first shutdown, I don't think anybody knew where this would go. And I did 3 things in my first 3 weeks as interim CEO. And one was supported by the job retention scheme. The first one was to cancel an already declared dividend to conserve cash for the company. The second one was to cancel all cash bonuses for all management. And the third one was to guarantee full pay and incentives to all customer-facing staff, all engineers, all call centre operatives. And we were able to do that. And we said we would do that irrespective of whether they could carry out their duties. We were able to do that because of the support of the coronavirus job retention scheme. And we did furlough engineers. We followed the government guidelines, and we paid in total to staff who were furloughed £35 million, of which £27 million was made by the government and was passed on to our colleagues. And we are very grateful. This scheme did exactly what it was set up to do, which was to preserve jobs, because at that point we didn't know what was going to happen. And at our peak, we had over 6,000 people furloughed. So we have accessed that. But the job retention scheme is very different to the ongoing negotiations. and it was automatically accessed by us, and we are very grateful.
So to clarify, you received £27 million of government support.
We had government made £27 million of a £35 million payment to colleagues who could not perform their duties during coronavirus in the first lockdown, yes. Was
there any other support that was received, financial support by the government over the course of the pandemic?
No other financial support. We didn't access the loan schemes or anything like that. It was the furlough scheme that we accessed.
Thank you for that. And as you've said there, the government were not aware of your plans to fire and rehire at the point at which you accessed £27 million of taxpayer support.
So the first time that we furloughed people was in March. The first time we would have claimed that would have been on the 19th of May for the first 2 months of March and April. And the government would have been aware of our Section 188 notice because we're obliged to file an HR1 form at the same time with the Department of Work and Pensions, and that would have been on the 15th of July.
And just to very quickly come back on the point about the Section 188 notice before I hand back to the chair, you are required to give 90 days notice for that. Obviously, we are far beyond that 90-day period. Why were you unable to do the negotiations first before issuing that Section 188 notice?
So I believe the period has been cut from 90 days to 45 days in the legislation as it's been changed. And you're right, we are required to give 45 days notice. And therefore, 45 days after the 15th of July, we could have proceeded to act on the Section 188 notice. But because we're committed to negotiations, we didn't. We parked that. Now, I know that there's a question over whether you do have to give this upfront or not. And ordinarily, companies wouldn't, and I don't think governments would, share the legal advice. However, given that this is such an important point, if it would help the committee, I'd be very happy for Centrica's lawyers and their external counsel, GMB's lawyers and external counsel, and the committee's lawyers and external counsel to meet and exchange the legal advice. I think it has to be done lawyer to lawyer, because I do think this point needs clarified. And I've made that point to Gavin Newlands in the bill that he's taken through Parliament. I've met with him twice. I think a clarification in the law would be most helpful. But if it would help the committee, perhaps our lawyers could all meet to share their interpretation and come to a common view.
Thank you for that. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thanks, Charlotte. Judith Cummings, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's fair to say that what we're trying to establish here, Mr. O'Shea, is just whether Centrica are taking advantage of a COVID pandemic to fire and rehire staff, and vast amounts of staff at that. So my questions are to you, and it's a series of questions, and they're all very short, so if you can be concise in your answers so that we can catch up on a bit of time, please. Now, the GMB said that you only had 2 days of meetings before fire and rehire. Can you explain this further, please?
Yeah, so we made our announcement on the 11th of June, stated. We then had meetings with the GMB, Unison and other unions on the 8th and 9th of July. And we had the statement that Mr. Bowden referred to, which said all unions within British Gas will oppose these changes. Our legal advice stated that that was the point at which it became possible that we wouldn't have a negotiated settlement. That's why we issued the Section 188 notice on the 15th of July.
I'm trying to understand the context here, Mr. O'Shea, so if you bear with me, please. I mean, from my understanding, by issuing a Section 188 notice, did you not realise that this would undermine trust in negotiations right from the very start? And I'm just trying to establish, how long have you been Chief Executive Officer, please?
I was appointed on an interim basis in March last year and then permanently in April.
So, and have you been a CEO before?
No, I was CFO of Centrica and CFO in a number of companies before that.
Right, so can you give us an idea about the last 10 years at Centrica? Just what have industrial relations been like with GMB in Centrica over the last decade? How many industrial disputes have there been? How much strike action have there been? Just so that we can get some context here.
Yeah, so in the last 10 years, I think that's useful, the context. We've had one localised industrial action, I think, in Merseyside. But in that same period, we've lost 1 million customers in our engineering business and more than half our profit.
Right, no, it's about industrial relations I'm asking here, Mr. O'Shea. So there's been one localised strike in the last 10 years and no national strike action in the last 10 years. So you're telling us that despite good industrial relations, I think that's a record that I'd be proud of if I was Chief Executive of Centrica over the last 10 years. So there's been no industrial relations disputes in the last 10 years up until now. And that's within 3 months of your appointment, when you threatened the whole UK workforce with fire and rehire. Within 3 months of your appointment as the CEO.
Within 3 months, yes. On the 15th of July,
thank you.
Had to issue that to have a fair process under Section 1.
Can I ask you, have you any idea whatsoever what it's like to live with the threat of fire and rehire like that? Do you know what it's doing to the staff that you're responsible for? And in terms of firing and rehiring, what's next? Are you going to fire and rehire all your workers?
So there are over 83% of our colleagues have accepted the offer that we've made. And I gave you the high level of some of the offers. And Mr. Bowden, and I think Mr. Bowden and I agree on more than we disagree on, but Mr. Bowden's laid out the fact that we are asking people to work extra hours.
Just, I've had people write, I've had testimony from your staff. One man who says, actually, I don't know if it's a man or a woman, I've had chest pains for a few weeks now, anxiety, body aches, headaches, and shortness of breath. This person even took a COVID test because he thought that was the reason, but it wasn't. It was anxiety because of this fire and rehire action that you're taking. Would you care to comment?
Undoubtedly, what I'm asking people to do is difficult. I don't shy away from that. However, my view is that I would rather do everything in my power to save the 20,000 jobs that we've got, rather than watch. I had one colleague tell me the other day, they've been with us 2 years and been through 3 rounds of redundancy. I know this puts a lot of pressure on people. Only yesterday, my wife and teenage son had a package of excrement delivered to them with notes about fire and rehire. This is something that affects absolutely everybody. I'm not immune to this.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Shea.
Thank you, Judith. Zara Sultana, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to touch on a point that Mr. Bowden made earlier about the profitability of the company. So Centrica reported an operating profit before exceptional items and tax of 901 million in 2019, and its profitability in terms of operating in the UK home heating business rose by 27% in the first 6 months of 2020. I've got a very simple question. Are these redundancies and this tactic of fire and rehire necessary? I'll go to Mr. Bowden first and then Mr. O'Shea.
Thanks very much, Sarah. No, I mean, as you would expect, we would say they're not. And if we had done what is normally the case in this circumstance, and the business had entered into negotiations with a view to seeking an agreement without the threat, then I think the tone of the negotiation would have made the possibility of an outcome an awful lot better. But if you start off by turning up in this circumstance, then you end up with people even more reactive and resistant to change than they would normally be. But this is a workforce that has a history of change. If I put it into an analogous example, it's a little bit like us as a union carrying out a ballot for industrial action, getting a strike mandate, and then sending to the employer our pay and conditions claim and saying, this is what we want, and if you don't agree to it, well, we're going on strike. So the cart was put very much before the horse. And on profitability, our view is that the business does have underlying profitability. It also has challenges. That's why in the course of hundreds of hours of negotiations, we have made a huge number of changes, including, for example, the workforce being prepared to accept a 3-year pay freeze. That doesn't suggest anything other than a degree of sense on the part of the workforce. But the business remains an underlying profitability. I won't repeat the points that I put on the record previously, but I will say that the business says that the underlying operating profitability is one of its fundamental financial measures.
Thank you, Mr. Bowden. Mr. O'Shea?
So the reality is, you're right, our underlying, or what we call adjusted operating profit for 2019 was 901 million. The unadjusted number was a loss of £1.1 billion after tax. And the underlying number is what we think is the ongoing performance of the business. But the reality is, in 2019, Centrica lost over £1 billion. Now, I've mentioned earlier that I think having to issue a Section 188 notice up front doesn't help negotiations. I think companies have to be able in some way to change their terms and conditions under limited circumstances. Employment rights are incredibly important, but I think companies have to have the right to make changes. But as I mentioned, I think it would be very helpful if, as Mr. Bowden said, it doesn't have to be upfront in the negotiations. Now, I did challenge the legal advice that I got because I didn't feel entirely comfortable with that. I didn't underestimate the impact, but I also take seriously my responsibility to follow the laws that are in place at the moment. And my legal advice was very clear, that in order to have a meaningful consultation with colleagues, you have to do this up front. I understand that in the ASDA case where GMB were involved, actually bringing it in later in the process caused problems. So I really do hope that out of this we can change the timing at which a Section 188 notice has to be served.
Thank you. I'm going to try to be super quick with my next two questions. Again, starting off to Mr. Bowden, you've suggested that Centrica has effectively proposed to cut pay by 10% and introduce zero-hour contracts. Centrica have denied this to either be the intention or the impact of its new contract. So why is there disagreement on this very point? If you could be quite quick with your response, if that's possible.
Yeah, I'll be quick on the first point because I think I've covered it previously. But if you require people on a current hourly rate of between 14 and 19 pounds per hour to do between 5.5 and 8 hours of extra work a week without paying them, then their hourly rate reduces by something between 10 and 18%, depending on the number of hours. So it's a simple mathematical calculation. The bulk of the workforce, 5,000 plus individuals, are being asked to do an extra 3 hours a week with no guaranteed pay for it, and to do an extra half hour at the beginning and end of the day, bringing them up to 8 hours. So that's over 15% cut in their hourly rate. And in terms of on the 0 hours, we've drawn a parallel to this with the reduced control that members have over when they work and the hours of coverage that they have. And that is the way in which our members would seek to describe it. I won't do it if there isn't time. I'm happy to write to you on this, but I was going to just read to you what one of our single parent members said to the Welsh First Minister on Friday around this particular point, if that's appropriate. But if time's tight, I can forward that in, whichever you want.
Forward it in. I'll just finish with my final question, and this is to both the panelists. GMB and Centrica have both accused each other of using regrettable language during the conduct of this dispute, including using offensive language. How might both of you, both parties, go ahead resolving these issues in a more constructive fashion?
So, as I mentioned, if I may go first, I'm committed to working with all of our trade unions. We have good relations with Unite, with Unison. Relations with GMB at the moment are strained, but I'm committed to working with Mr. Bowden and the rest of his colleagues going forward. We've seen the use of terms that I frankly haven't heard for decades, such as a GMB official talking about scabs. I think that that's an abhorrent term. We've had lists of colleagues who've been working circulated on WhatsApp groups to other engineers so they can be intimidated. As I told you earlier on, my family had a package of excrement delivered yesterday. We've had police involved in people going to some of our executives' homes. The police are involved in the case involving my wife and son. I think that we have to find a way, and I'm committed to finding a way with Mr. Bowden to de-escalate this. We have to move forward. We cannot succeed as a company without our colleagues, and our colleagues have trade unions. We will work together, and I hope that GMB can join us with Unite and Unison in a progressive partnership to build this company to help deliver the net zero carbon initiatives and to progress on the COP26 targets that we'll no doubt come out with shortly.
If I can just very quickly respond from my point of view, picking out which is the way in which the business has sought to respond to the fact that that some 7,000, 8,000 of its workforce rejected the proposals, has been to single them out and to suggest that in some way they're out of kilter. And I have to say that in my 25 years as an official, I have never seen the level of pressure brought to bear on a workforce at any point. The endless stream of meetings, of emails, of leverage applied by managers at all level within the business, telephoning people within hours, outside of hours, telling them that in some way there was something wrong with them having a different view from the one of the company has been absolutely unprecedented. I've not seen anything like that before, and I'm not surprised either by the outcome where you push people into that position, nor by the effects that it's had on people's mental health and other well-being. I would be more than happy to have further discussion with Mr. O'Shea around this point, but the measures and the means employed by the business are not consistent with what happens normally in these circumstances. Normally, a business sits down and says, we need to make change for this reason, and we would always engage in that circumstance. If at the end of that, as a last resort agreement has not been reached, then there may be further changes. But fire and rehire should be outlawed, and it should absolutely be outlawed as a tool that can be employed before discussion has even started.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zara. Mark Jenkinson, please.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just start by condemning the language suggested by Mr. O'Shea, the intimidation and the abuse of anybody's family? I don't think that helps anybody in this dispute at all. To Mr. Bowden, I've met with some employees of Centrica who have significant issues still around the start times issue, the additional hours, but also the worry that there are no, despite the company's guarantees, there are effectively no guarantees because of contractual clauses enabling the company to change contracts with reasonable notice and the removal, alleged removal of collective bargaining clauses. But one thing that stood out to me, the Centrica put a lot of weight on the additional that can be earned through the CTAP scheme, but there's a lot of concern that, and Mr. O'Shea will probably want to comment on this after you, a lot of concern that employees can end up in an hours deficit because of this scheme. One particular example that was brought to my attention was that currently an engineer is allowed 40 minutes to service an inset gas fire, which can take an hour. Mr. O'Shea said this is all about the customer. So that right away might put an employee in a deficit. But strikingly, he said that a boiler lead, which takes 10 minutes to input into an app, including a couple of photographs, actually credits them with 42 minutes, more than a safety critical issue such as a gas fire. I just wonder if you had any comment on that, and like I said, Mr. O'Shea might want to come back on that after you as well.
Thanks very much. Yeah, there's quite a lot within that. CTAP, for anybody that isn't familiar with it, is the company's new bonus scheme that it wants to introduce. And one of the reasons that we ended up in the dispute that we did is that bonus scheme and how it worked was not a finished article when people were being asked to vote on it. I think Mr. O'Shea asked people to take a leap of faith, and the difficulty with that was twofold. One, that they already had the gun placed to their head from fire and rehire, and secondly, the business has a history going back over at least 5 years of broken promises and of failing to deliver on all sorts of things, including the apprentices that Mr. O'Shea referred to previously and can't be laid at his door because they predate him. But there was a promise made in return for pensions changes by the workforce, 450 apprentices, and at the point at which we were consulting on this offer, it was less than 50 who had been appointed. So the business don't believe the management because the management don't do what they say they'll do. In terms of the proposal, the expectation is that people will work harder and faster. So that means that there will be less time to carry out certain tasks, and the way in which things are measured, for example, the credit given for selling, which is what the boiler lead is, is ultimately determined by the business. And the problem is that we don't have the clear contractual protections within that allow people to have a certainty about how they work, and to not think that as things move forward, the business will either turn up or turn up the speed at which the production line operates, if you like. So if people do manage to perform, then they'll just move the goalposts around that. So an awful lot within that. The workforce ultimately do not trust their management, and that is one of the major obstacles to be overcome in terms of making for a successful business, which is what everybody would like to see happen.
Mr. O'Shea, how do you overcome those issues?
So firstly, your comment about initially the contracts that we proposed did have a clause, which is a fairly standard clause, I understand, in employment contracts, which said that things could be changed with 28 days notice. Mr. Bowden's right in that trust is not where I would like it to be between our colleagues, and people raised that. So we've removed that clause. That clause is not in our contract. So we listened to people, we took it out. What we're looking for is, at the moment, we have people that visit on average 6.4, 6.5 customers a day. And I wasn't in anywhere near as much of the negotiations as Mr. Bowden was, but there was the odd meeting I went to, and he and I, he demonstrated on a whiteboard customer productivity. And one of the points he made, which really resonated with me, was that we have made the company complicated, and we, as management, have reduced the productivity of our team. And what we're asking actually is for people to go back to levels of productivity we saw before. Now, it's right that some of our engineers pride themselves on being great at selling. And I've spoken to some of them, and they want that protected. And I've spoken to others who were worried because they say they couldn't sell a fire in a cold country. And so therefore they don't want to have to rely on that. So our scheme seeks to reward all of the different types of engineers that we've got. Those that sell well can be rewarded. They can have time credit or they can take extra money. And those that don't want to sell can get the same credit. And our CTAP scheme is not just about pay, because for some of our people, it's not just about money. But you can earn up to £11,000, I think, if you visit 9 customers a day. And you can decide whether to claim overtime or whether to use CTAP. There's flexibility, that's at our colleague's choice. Or you can bank up to 3 extra days time off in lieu every month. Because it is important, one of the points Mr. Bowden's made, which I completely agree with, is work-life balance is very important. And what we've learned is, as engineers and other colleagues work through their life, the same for all of us, I suppose, what's important changes. And so for some people that want more time off, they can bank time. For some people that want more money, they can earn more money. And it's really up to our colleagues with regards to that. But I do think that we have to rebuild trust. I'm committed to doing that with our unions as we move forward. But what we're looking for is productivity to go back to where it was. And that's something we have to be looking for, not just in Centrica, but in the country as a whole.
Thank you, Mark. Lastly, please, Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Bowden, you made it clear you think fire and rehire should be outlawed. Do you support my colleague Gavin Newland's bill on this subject?
Yes, on both counts. Absolutely, it should be. It should be outlawed. It has no place in modern industrial relations. It is an utterly un-British type of mechanism that can be, as we've seen within British Gas, very wrongly used with consequences that are of no benefit ultimately to anybody. So what GMB would like to see is for it to be outlawed and for the process of industrial relations to be able to be carried out as it generally is right across the economy in a sensible fashion.
Mr. Brown, sorry to cut across because I'm conscious I'm last and time's nearly finished. Can you confirm, is there similar employment legislation elsewhere in Europe and the collective bargaining still takes place even where fire and rehire is outlawed?
No, it's very unusual. It does exist in 1 or 2 other European countries, if I recall correctly, but it is very unusual. In most other European countries, the negotiations and changes carried out by consent in a far more comprehensive and inclusive way than certainly has been the case within British Gas over the last 6 months. Okay,
thanks for that clarification. Mr. O'Shea, you said you only want legal clarification when to serve fire and rehire notice. Does it not go deeper on that? If it can work in other countries in Europe, why do British companies feel the need to keep this insurance policy?
Look, I think that companies have to have the ability in limited circumstances to change contracts, rather than just watch as we have competitiveness erode and jobs walk out the door. If we don't do this, the jobs will go to the gig economy, which I don't think anybody wants. But I do think that the circumstances have to be limited.
Yeah, just cut across that. I mean, there's a wider issue of employment rights. If the jobs are just going to migrate to the gig economy, does that suggest deeper problems than just fire and rehire?
No, this is a problem for legacy companies like ours. We've been going for over 200 years. And we have terms and conditions that have been built up over a number of years. And if we continue with those terms and conditions, the market has changed. Customer needs have changed. Customer wants have changed. We have to change as well. So I don't think companies should have the right to do this under any circumstance at all. Employment rights are important, but it's inescapable that our use of contractors, the gig economy, has increased substantially over the past several years. And what I'm trying to do is to stop that, is to protect the direct labour employed model that we've got. We've got the biggest unionised workforce of our kind in the UK. I'm proud of that. I want to keep that. But we need to be able to change. And that's why I've told your colleague Gavin Newlands that I think that we should not lose the ability for companies to make changes, but we should change when the Section 188 notice has to be served. And I would argue that it wouldn't be in line with British values to watch strong legacy companies like British Gas, like other companies, simply die over time, because ultimately that's what we'll face.
Is this not another mixture of language? Because Mr. Bowden's saying it's very un-British, the fire and rehire, and you're saying it's British values that need to be protected. So again, does that not show we're using language that isn't really helpful? You know, there's a bigger picture we need to keep in mind.
There is a bigger picture. I agree. And for me, it's about saving the 20,000 jobs we've got and growing those jobs and helping the country deliver the net zero targets that we've got.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to colleagues for your questions. Just one quick follow-up before I close the session to an end. I was concerned to hear from Mr. Bowden about pressure being applied to individual workers as opposed to going through the union negotiation route. I mean, Mr. O'Shea, you've not been calling engineers yourself, have you?
So I do speak to colleagues. I spoke to an engineer who's on strike on Saturday because I got a message from him, and I called and had a chat, and I didn't try and pressure him. I listened to him, and he gave me some ideas as to how we could move forward. So I do speak to colleagues very regularly, but I haven't called anyone to pressure anyone to sign a contract. I respect people's right to go on strike. I take exception to inflammatory language and intimidation, but I haven't done that.
Thank you for that. Okay, well, look, as I said at the beginning, it's unfortunate that we're having to have this session in public evidence before the committee, and I sincerely hope, as do colleagues on a cross-party basis on this committee, that you're able to resolve this both for your workers, for the success of the business in the future, and indeed for your customers, who I know are also wanting you to resolve this. The key issue, I think, for us to take away is this issue of interpretation of the legislation. As it stands, I'm not entirely convinced by the argument that you had to issue the fire and rehire so early because of the law, because if that was the case, every other business would be doing it at the moment, going through these redundancy processes. So my sense at the end of this hearing is that was probably your decision, Mr. O'Shea, and I think you might want to reflect on that, because I think from my perspective, it was probably the wrong way of doing it. But we will take up your offer of seeing the legal advice, and we will talk in private session with your lawyers and also with the trade union as we look to the employment rights bill that's going to be coming to the House in due course to see whether we need to ban fire and rehire as a legal right in legislation. But thank you to both of you for your time this morning. Thank you, Chris O'Shea, CEO from Centrica, and Justin Bowden, National Officer from the GMB, for your time.